So in the last Mishnah, we began the conversation about what to do if you have a majority of Bnei Israel or a majority of the Kahanim that are Tameh to bring, and so that the Korban Pesach is brought even in Tumah because of the majority of the Korban Pesach being brought in Tumah. And the Gemara, in this first version, brought a statement from Rav Chisda that we're talking about the type of tumah where the knife itself came into contact with a dead person. So the person holding the knife would also become tameh, and so you can't slaughter this korban. You can't shech the korban without actually becoming tameh. And the distinction the Gemara is making is between when the korban itself is tameh, where that's a lesser degree of tumah because only the animal, the korban, the meat is tameh, versus when the person who is going to eat the korban, they themselves are tameh, which is more severe. As the Gemara said yesterday, that a person who eats kachim, who eats a korban, while they themselves are tameh, is kares, that the soul is cut off from its soul, from its source. That's a more severe punishment. Whereas if somebody themselves are not tameh, but the meat that they're eating of the korban is tameh, that's not kares on the person, but rather it's just that a prohibition. And so the communal obligation of bringing the korban pesach will supersede the lesser prohibition in that case. And someone who themselves is tameh would not be allowed to do the korban pesach. And this is Rav Kahana's opinion, based on the idea that tuma dechuya b'tzibur, that when we say that in our Mishnah, or really from the pasuk, that if the community itself is a korban is tameh, that you can bring a korban pesach, that the prohibition of korban pesach of tumah remains. It's just that korban pesach as a communal obligation supersedes that prohibition, and therefore we try to minimize and limit within that prohibition how much of the prohibition we're going to transgress. And if we have a lesser severe prohibition for the majority of the community, we're going to go with that rather than the more severe prohibition for the entire community. And this is the opinion of Rav Chisda. The Gemara now says Rava is going to say, and this is about 10 lines from the bottom of Ayin Tes Amid Aleph. The Rava says, Afilat Mein Nami Yavdi. Everybody, all the Tameh people, even the ones that are themselves, their own body is Tameh, will do the korban pesach in this case, where only the meat, or the majority of the meat is going to be Tameh. My time. What's the reason? The Sifra, it says, the pasuk juxtaposes these two concepts. It says first, if the meat of the korban itself will become tameh, then it shall not be eaten; it shall be burned. And the meat, only a tahor person, somebody who themselves is tahor, may eat the meat, and not someone who's tameh. So we see that these two apply together. And wherever we say that even though the korban itself is tameh, where the prohibition is it shouldn't be eaten, we're not going to say that. We're going to say you may eat it. So too, the other part of the pasuk, which is the prohibition for someone who themselves, their body is tameh, may not eat the korban. It will not apply because the first part of the pasuk doesn't apply. In other words, this is the concept that if the korban pesach is allowed to be eaten when the korban pesach, the lamb itself is tameh, so too a person who they themselves are tameh are allowed to eat it. However, if the prohibition is in place that you cannot eat a korban pesach when the lamb itself is tameh, then also the person who is tameh may not eat it. And so he makes no such distinction and says as long as the majority of Bnei Israel are tameh, or the vessels in the Beis HaMikdash, the majority of tameh, which means that all lambs are going to become tameh, anybody that's tameh is allowed to do the korban pesach. The next Gemara is going to go into a nuanced theoretic question. In the Mishnah, it says if the majority of Am Yisrael are tamei, then you bring the Korban Pesach in Tumah. If the minority are tamei, then you bring the Korban Pesach. The first Korban Pesach is going to be B'tahara, and those people, those individuals, even if it's 49% of Am Yisrael are going to be tamei, they will bring the Korban Pesach as individuals in the second Pesach, because it says ish, if a man shall be tamei, they will bring the Korban Pesach the second time. So that tells us that individuals are not the community. At first the Gemara is going to say, well, what about if it's 50-50 exactly, which the Mishnah didn't say, and we're going to have three opinions. The three opinions are each going to have a brisa that seem to be saying exactly like that, and we're going to have an answer for each one of those. And then ultimately further opinions as to where what this majority of Am Yisrael tamei doesn't mean the entirety of Am Yisrael or each tribe, etc. So Itma, this is 5 lines from the bottom of Ayin Tes Amud Aleph. It said, Haresha Yisrael mechza Torah mechza tamei. If Bnei 50-50 tamei and tahor. Rav says the majority, that half and half is like a majority. Rav Kahana and Rav Kahana said it's not like a majority. So what does that mean? So now here's the 3 opinions. Rav that half and half is like a majority. So even though if the entirety of Am Yisrael or the majority of Am Yisrael are tamei, even those that are tahor, they themselves don't have to be careful. Normally, you'd be very careful. They don't have to be careful, but they're allowed to bring their carbon even in Tumah. However, when it's 50-50, they have to be careful. Each group that's 50% of Am Yisrael, so the 50% that are tahor must make it themselves and keep it tahor. And the 50% that are tamei, they will keep to themselves. And each one of these groups are like their own majority, and they will make it by themselves. They bring the Korban Pesach by themselves. Rav Kahana, however, Rav Kahana says that 50-50 is not like a majority. So therefore, Tahar says Harisha. Those that are Tahar will do it in the first. The 50% that they themselves are Tahar will bring it in the first Pesach, and Tameim and since the 50% counts as a minority, that those that are tamei are going to go wait for the second Pesach, for Pesach Sheni, to bring their carbon. Those that say, however, that no, Amar of Kahana that the 50-50 are not considered a majority, and therefore Tahir Moses Harishon, the first group will do the carbon Pesach the first time because they themselves are Tahir. However, now we go to Ayin Testament base, Tumein Einois Eloyas Harishon. The first. However, the Tamei group cannot do it in the first Pesach because they're not a majority. So therefore, they can't do the Korban Pesach this time because they're considered individuals. However, they also can't do the second Korban Pesach because they're not a minority, and you would require that it's a minority. Tosfos struggles with what's the basis for this. As we explained, the Torah says, an individual, a person shall bring the carbon, that's tamei, shall bring the Korban Pesach the second time, and that tells us not a community. Well, these are either they're individuals, so then they can bring the second Pesach, and if they're not, they're excluded from the second Korban Pesach, and so they should be obligated in the first. Tosfos has an explanation, but the question is where the basis for this would be, and Rav Kahana in this version is saying that they're in limbo. They're not a majority, and therefore they can't do the Korban Pesach in the first Pesach. They also are not a minority, so they can't do it in the second. They'll have a ruba. They'll have a minuta. So Tanan, we learned. Nitma kol oiruba. In our Mishnah, the first statement says, if the community or the majority of the community become tamei, oishu kahanim tameim, or the kahanim are tamei. Even if in that case, even if the community is tahor, so then they bring the Korban Pesach in Tumah. So Ruba Yehuda Avdi B'Tumah, only if the majority of the community are tamei. Aval Palga B'Palga, But if it's half and half, then they don't do a carbon Pesach in the first, and that's a contradiction to Rav. Kashil Rav. Rav. So Rav says, no, actually 50-50 counts as a majority, as he said. Rubav di kulu betuma. But there, as we made a distinction, if the majority of the community are tamei, then everybody is allowed to be bring it in tuma. They don't have to be careful. Palga. But if it's 50-50, then each group has to be careful. And so each do it for themselves. And it's actually logical to learn that way in the Mishnah. And so too is it reasonable. For it says in the end of the Mishnah, B'Seifa, Nitma miyatakol tahir. If the minority of the community became tamei, tahir inosin esarisha. So then those that are tahor will do the first Pesach. The Tumeina says Shosheni, and the tamei will do the second Pesach. Miya to the avli, so we can infer only if it's a minority, but b'sheni, davli b'sheni, avapaga, but if it's half and half, lo avli b'rishon, they would not be pushed off to the second Pesach, and they do it in the first Pesach. And as Rav said, each is going to have to do it for itself. Well, if that's the case, if you're going to infer from the end of the Mishnah that only if it's a minority are they postpone, the Tamei people postpone to the second Pesach, but if it's 50-50, then they each do it on their own. Ve'ela kashel Rav Kahana, so that seems to be a contradiction from the end of the Mishnah to Rav Kahana. Amalach Rav Kahana, Rav Kahana says actually the way he learns the minority in the Mishnah this way. Nitmu miyatakol tahir. If the halach of the end of the Mishnah said that if the minority are tamei, they can do it in the second Pesach, and the majority will do the first Pesach because they're tahor. Only there can they do it in the second Pesach. But if it's 50-50, then this is the second version of Kahana. The tahor people will do the Pesach in the first. However, the Tamei people will not do it in the first or the second. They can't do it in the first because they're not the majority, and they can't do it in the second because they weren't the minority, as we saw at the top of the page. So Gemara says, great, that's according to the second version of Rav Kahana. But in the first version of Rav Kahana, which we said that they can do it in the second Pesach, so it's the same halacha as the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if the minority is Tamei, so then they would do it in the second Pesach. But in truth, Rav Kahana says even if they're not a minority, as long as they're not a majority, even if they're 50%, they would do it in the second Pesach. So according to that, the Amar of Kahana Tahir says Sarishan and Tumeina says Asheni, Ma'ikalamema. So how you can explain the Mishnah? Why does it say minority when it actually even is true for 50-50? Amachar of Kahana who adin afila palga palga. You're right. In the Mishnah we could say that in the end of the Mishnah that even half and half, exactly 50% are Tamei and 50% are Torah, the Tamei people would do Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach. Nami Tahir Nesenes Arishan, Tumenes Sheni. V'haidik Tani Miyat. So why did the Mishnah say Miyatakol, the minority of the community are Tamei? I did Tani Reisha Ruba, Tani Nami Sefer Miyuta, because it's symmetrical with the beginning of the Mishnah. The beginning of the Mishnah said the majority of the community are Tamei. Then everybody does the Pesach in the first Pesach in Tuma. So then it said the end of the Mishnah says, and if the minority are Tamei, they do it the Tamei people will do it in the Pesach Sheni. But the truth would be, even if it's 50-50. In any case, there's no inference from the Mishnah itself is you can infer from the beginning and the end differently, and they each version here is going to explain the Mishnah to its opinion. The next, we're going to have three brises, which seem to say like each one of these opinions. And then the other opinions are going to have to explain each one of the brises. Tanikavase the Rav, so we have a brisa that concurs with Rav. Tanikavase the Rav Kahana, and the Lishna, Katrei Lishna. And we have a brisa for each one of the versions of Rav Kahana. Tanikavase the Rav. So we learned like a brisa like Rav. Yisrael mechza Torah mechza Tamei. Bnei Yisrael are half Tahor and half Tamei. Halalo Isalatzman, Malalo Isalatzman. Each one will do for themselves, as Rav explained because each one is seen as a majority. And so each one can do it in the first Pesach because they count as the majority of Bnei Yisrael Tamei. However, since it's 50-50, the other group, the Tahor group, may not bring it in Tumah, so they have to be very careful to make sure that they remain Tahor, even though that half of Am Yisrael is Tamei. Tani Kalisha Kama, the Rav Kahana, we have a brisa that concurs with the first version of Rav Kahana, who said that the 50% Tamei are considered the minority, and therefore they can't bring the Korban Pesach the first time round. Rather, they are viewed as individuals, and they bring the Korban Pesach in the second round on the 14th day of Iyar. A month later, once they have time to become Tar. So, where is the brisa for that? The brisa says if Bnei Yisrael are half Tar and half Tamei, so the Torah people go ahead and bring the Korban Pesach the first time round, and the Tamei people will bring the Korban Pesach the second time round, as Rav Kahana said. And we now also have a brisa like the third opinion, which is the second version of Rav Kahana. If Bnei Yisrael are 50% Torah and 50% Tamei, the first group, the Torah group, are going to do the Korban Pesach the first time round. And the Tamei group cannot bring the Korban Pesach in the first or second of the Pesach. The first one they can't because they're not a majority, and in the second they can't because they're not a minority. So the Gemara now is going to ask for how each one interprets the brisa. That's the two brisas that seem not to work with them. And the Gemara now introduces something that is a discussion later in the Gemara, and this is the question when the Torah says that a person is tamei. It says ish, a man is going to be tamei. The Gemara later is going to talk about whether two questions. Question number one: are females obligated in the Korban Pesach, or is it just a mitzvah that they're if they do, they fulfill the mitzvah, but they're not obligated? So that's a einon chayva. It's not an obligation. And even if they are in the first in the first Pesach, what about the second Pesach? If they were tamei for the first Pesach and could not bring the Korban Pesach, are they also obligated to do a Korban Pesach sheni, or is that not an obligation? And that would change the whole meaning of the brisa here, because if that's the case, if women are not obligated, so then we're going to have to see it as two separate obligations here, and two separate counts: account for the men and account for the women. And the women who are not obligated may tip the scale and change the halacha. So so according to Rav, and to the second version of Rav Kahana, how do they explain the brisa that says explicitly that women that the majority are, if there's 50-50, then the 50% that are tamei are going to do the second Pesach, and that's not like Rav, who says that they both do the first Pesach, and not like the second version that says that they can't even do the second Pesach. So how are they going to explain it? That the men are 50-50 tamei and tar, and the women are more than 50% tamei. And that brisa's opinion is nashim berisha rishus, that the women are not obligated in the Korban Pesach first time round, and therefore dal nashim, if you exclude the women mitmeim from the count of the tamei, on account of that they're not, even though that they are tamei, the majority of Am Yisrael are tamei right now. However, it's only 50% of the men folk, and the reason is because this brisa considers the women not obligated. V'havalu tamein miuta. So therefore, the minority, Tamei people are now a minority individuals because they are only it's only on account of the women, which are not obligated, that they're going to reach this the point. So the men are a minority, and so the miyuta yidchu Pesach sheni. So they do bring a Pesach sheni. Now the other brisa, l'Rava l'shakama the Rav Kahana. So according to Rav, who says that they're both going to do the Korban Pesach in the first time round, and according to the first version of Rav Kahana that says that they bring the Korban Pesach, the Tamei people bring the Korban Pesach the second time round. How do they explain the brisa that says that they don't bring a Korban Pesach in the first or the second? Now the Tanya Tahar knows that it's Orishan to main Enos Elis Orishan Velis Sheni Echem Matarzil. How do they explain that? So Rav Matarzil, so Rav is going to explain in his version. He says like this: Kagoyin Shah Yisrael Mechzat Tamein and Mechzat Tahar. That the men are 50-50 Tamei. V'nashim oitfei Salat Tahar. And however, the women are going to be mostly tahor, and they're going to add to the count and make the majority, the tamei, the tahor group majority. Because and they say that the first Korban Pesach, even women are obligated. So we're going to count the women and the men who are tamei, who are 50-50 tamei. Those 50% men that are tamei are actually in the minority in the first Pesach. So they can't bring the Korban Pesach the first time around because they're a minority. However, b'sheni reshus. But this price is of the opinion that the second Pesach women are women are not obligated, and therefore by the time it gets to the second Pesach, these 50% of men that were tamei the first time round and constituted a minority because the majority of women were not tamei. So by the time it gets to second Pesach and women are not obligated, so women are not in the count. So now they're 50% of the people, and they're not a minority, and so they can't bring the second Pesach either. Berisha le'avdi, so they can't bring the first Pesach to have a lumiyut because they're minority, because we count the women because they're obligated. Umiyutu le'avdi, however, umiyutu le'avdi berisha, and the first a minority can't bring the Korban Pesach while tamei in the first. No b'sheni le'avdi, and even though that they were tamei the first time round, they can't bring the Korban Pesach the second because dal nashaminayu, because we exclude the women from the count in the second Pesach because they're not obligated in the second Pesach. Vavalu palga, and they're 50-50 upalga le'avdi b'sheni. And since by the time we get to the second Pesach, the count for who's tamei and who's tar only applies to the men, and as far as that count, they're 50-50. They're not a minority, and to bring the second Pesach, you have to be a minority. Ula Rav Kahana has a different interpretation of this brisa. He says the reason why they wouldn't bring the first or second Pesach, the Amar Palganami Avdi B'Sheni. He says, wait, but when half the community is tamei in the first Pesach, they would bring the Korban Pesach in the second. That's the first version of Kahana. How does he explain this brisa? He explains it like this: the men were 50-50 tamei. V'nashim mashlimas l'toherin. However, the Am Yisrael 50-50 tamei. However, the reason really the men were more tamei than tar. The reason the census was 50-50 was because women brought it up to a 50%, because the majority of women were tahar, were pure, and so they brought the count up to 50-50. And women are obligated in the first Pesach, and so then it's a clear 50-50 count, because women are included and women bring it up to 50-50. However, in the second Pesach, women are not obligated. It's their choice if they bring a Korban Pesach in the second. So therefore, we can't count them in the second. So Berisha le'avdi, they don't bring a Korban Pesach in the first first Pesach. This majority of men that are tamei, which are really 50-50 of the total of Am Yisrael. They don't bring a Korban Pesach, have a palga, because they're only 50%. They're not a majority, and only majority can bring the first Pesach. So the first Korban Pesach, a 50-50 can't bring it. B'sheni, however, they can't bring the second Pesach either, because dal minayu nasha minayu. Because in the second Pesach we don't count the women because they're not obligated in the second Pesach, And in this case, the majority of women were tahor, the majority of men were tamei. So by the time we get to the second Pesach, we're only going to count the men, and at that point, in that count, it's the majority of men that are tamei, and the majority can't bring the second Pesach. Dal minayu dal nashim minayim and atarim mahavalu tamein ruba. So the tamei, the men folk that are tamei are the majority of the count. Ruba le'avdi b'sheni, and the majority will not do the second Pesach. Ula Rav Kahana, and how does Rav Kahana explain how the Tanya Haresha Yisrael Mechza Torah Mechza Tamein Halolo Esel Atzman Valolo Esel Atzman? The brisa that concurs with Rav says that if it's 50-50, each one will do the first Pesach, and each will do it in their own groups, so as not to make each other tamei. Rav Kahana, in one version, says you do the second, the 50% tamei will do the second Pesach. In the second version of Rav Kahana, you say they don't do it at all, and this brisa is a contradiction. So here Rav Kahana has to admit that this is not going to be a absolute opinion. It's going to be a machlokes tanoim. That we're going to have to say 50% tar and 50% tummy is a machlokes, whether that's like a majority or minority. And this brisa that concurs with Rav says that they count as a majority. John asked, you asked whether what's the basis for women being obligated in the first Pesach and not in the second Pesach. It's a Gemara later. Let's wait for that whole conversation in the Gemara. The Gemara is going to get to it. Right here, we're just bringing it in for the count of 50-50. Let's wait for that whole Gemara. We're pretty far behind. So we're just about getting up to today's daf. So let's wait for that. Thanks, John. So, Gufa, let's analyze the statement itself. If they're Bnei Yisrael are 50% Tamei and 50% Tar, the Brisa says that each one is going to do it separately for themselves. But if there are more Tamei people than Tar people, afila echad, even if it's just one person more, meaning it's 50% 0.001, it's going to be enough. So as long as there's one more person Tamei, so you did a census and it's 1.2 million Tahar and 1.2 and 1 million Tamei, so that's going to be sufficient. Lefisha ain karban tzibur chalak. And the basis for this idea is that a communal carbon, and this is a communal carbon, even though each group is going to make it by themselves, but it's a communal obligation. You can't have it split. Ein carbon tzibur chalak. You can't have it split, and some are going to do it one way and some are going to do another way. However, Rabbi Tzvi Fischer says, no, one person is not enough to make the community can be considered majority tummy. For it says, and this is, we'll now go to Daf Pei, the simple reading over here is you cannot bring the carbon Pesach in one of your gates, meaning you have to bring it in your shalayim. However, his drash is you cannot decide to bring the carbon Pesach in Tuma on account of one person. However, it doesn't even have to be the majority of Am Yisrael. He says that even one tribe, if the entirety or the majority of tribe of Binyamin are Tamei, that will allow for that group to bring it the carbon Pesach Betuma. Tamei v'shakal shvatim Torah, even though everybody else is Tahor. Halolo esel atzman v'lolo esel atzman, that the group of Binyamin, that's Tamei, will bring it for themselves, and all the other tribes will bring it for themselves, and that group can bring it Betuma. My time, and what's the basis for Rabbi Shimon? The Rabbi Shimon, Kasavar Shevet Echad Ikr says that one Shevet, one tribe counts as a kahal, a community, and since it says the community of Am Yisrael is going to bring it, so so that's sufficient. That's sufficient to count as a community that's Tamei that can bring the carbon Pesach B'Tumah. The Torah says that Yaakov was promised before Binyamin was born that Goy Kahal Goyim Yom Mecca, and so we see a Kahal, a community of is one tribe itself, and therefore, if one tribe is tamei, that would be sufficient for them to count as a tzibur, as a community tamei that can bring the carbon pesach. However, Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, he takes it one step further and he says, "Afilu shevet echad tamei." Since you, Rabbi Shimon, you are right that one tribe being tamei is sufficient to count as bringing the pesach b'tumah for that tribe, and since we also said that a communal carbon cannot be split down the middle, a communal carbon, if it's brought in tumah, then it's brought as a community in tumah. Therefore, even the rest of the tribes, if somebody wanted to bring it while tamei, he may. Because a communal carbon doesn't get split, and even the people that themselves are tahor don't have to be careful and can bring it in while tamei. Rabbi Yehuda, like Rabbi Shimon, each tribe itself counts as a community. It's like 50-50. And we don't split a carbon pesach, a communal carbon. And since the community in part will bring it in tumah, the rest can also bring it in tumah. They don't have to be careful. They're allowed to bring it even though they're tummy. Itmar was said, Amarav, if there are 50% of Yisrael that are tummy and 50% tahor, so what are you going to do? So Rav previously had said, well, just let each group bring it separately. The tummy people bring it together, and the tahor people bring it together, and they can all do it in the first Pesach. Here we have a statement of Rav. Amarav, matamin echad mehem b'sheretz. We make one person tummy by touching a dead rodent, and now we have one more person over the 50%, and that's sufficient to tip the balance. Vamai. So the Gemara says, why do we need that? Let each group do it separately, as Rav had said earlier. As Rav said, they can all each do it for themselves. So it's actually the Tabei people were 50% plus one person. So really, you already have a majority of tummy, and so everybody's going to bring it as a tummy group. So we already have a majority. Why do you need this extra one person touching a rodent? But on account of the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Masa that said one person is not sufficient to tip the balance, to bring it to more than 50% tummy, therefore we're adding one person by touching a rodent. So it says, well, if one person is not enough to tip the scale from 50%, so then we're back to the question. So go back to Rav's opinion. Each group do 50% by themselves, and these 50% by themselves, the tummy group will make their Pesach, and the Torah group will make their Pesach. Why are we adding to the tummy by making someone touch a tumah? Touch a rodent. If we're going to have an opinion that says that 50-50 is not going to be enough to do everybody do it betuma, and but we have a problem. You can't split the community either. As Rabbi Yehuda said, if part of the community are doing it in Tumah, then everybody can, because it's a communal carbon. You can't have some doing it one way, some the other. So you can't do Rav's previous suggestion of each group doing it separately. So you need to create a majority. So so we add somebody as in a Tumah Sheretz by touching a rodent, and then he'll be Tumah for that day. He'll bring that, but that night, he'll have gone to mikveh, and that night he'll be tahor already, can eat the carbon pesach, but at least the community can bring the carbon pesach in tumah, and say it doesn't really matter to him whether or not he's tamei or not. V'ula, however, Ula, he suggested different than Rav. Not that we're going to add someone in the count of tumah on account of touching a sheretz. Rather, we're going to send somebody, rather than making someone tamei, we just ask someone to leave Yerushalayim, to go to a distance away, so that he's now too far away to bring the Korban Pesach. And as we've seen before, and we're going to see a little more in detail, that somebody that's tamei is exempt of the first Pesach and brings it the second, or somebody that's too far away is exempt of the first Pesach and is going to bring it in the second. So just send somebody out. So first the Gemara asks, why did Ula suggest to send somebody away and not just to tip the scale by adding to the tummy? Why don't we just make one more person tamei sheretz? He said because he can send the Korban Pesach in by with someone else, and so the Korban Pesach can be brought for someone that's a tamei sheretz, because by that evening he'll be okay. So the Gemara says, okay, so v'yit man of a mace. So make him come into contact with a dead person. That's a problem, because you're going to exempt him now for 7 days from a carbon, and in those 7 days he also has to bring a carbon chagiga, the communal carbon. The chag carbon that each individual is going to bring, and since he's tamei for 7 days, he's not going to be able to bring it. The Gemara says, Well, you're postponing him from his Korban Pesach by sending him away for a month. Now, for today, you're sending him out of town, and he's going to postpone the Korban Pesach till the second. So, yes, but at least he has a makeup date. He can do it in the second Pesach. So Gemara says, so what? Chagiga as well. Since it's a 7-day process to become tahor, and he's making himself tamei in the morning of the 14th before Pesach, so then he'll complete his process by the last day of Yantif, so he can bring his chagiga that day. So he still has a makeup date. That's the 8th day of his tahara. He'll be able to bring the Pesach, the chagiga, the holiday offering that day. The Gemara says no. Kasavar ula kula tashlum in the rishonim. And to explain this, just a little bit about the chagiga. We saw this earlier. There's an obligation on the 15th day of Nisan, on the first day of Pesach, to bring a chagiga offering, a holiday offering. And you can bring it, if you missed the 15th, you can bring it on the 16th. You missed it on the 16th, you can bring it on the 17th, etc., till the last day of Yantif. There's a question, however, how to view this. Do we say that every day is a make-up date for the first obligation? And if you're exempt of the first obligation, you don't have a new obligation the next day, because you were exempt on the first day, you couldn't bring it. That's this opinion. And therefore, there is no make-up date on the last day of Yantif. However, there's another way of viewing it, is that every single day is its own obligation if you missed the first day. And therefore, you could make it up on the 8th day because there's a new obligation on that day. So if Ula is saying, I view this as an independent, as a single obligation on the first day of Yantif, and you're making him exempt on the first day of Yantif, so that you can't make him tamei because you're exempting him of an obligation of the chagiga offering. And you can't tell me to make it on the last day of Yantif, because that's not a make-up date for the first, it's not its own obligation, it's a make-up date for the first day of Yantif. And the first day of Yantif, this person is exempt because he's tamei. The Chazi Berisha and Chazi Bekulu. So somebody who is able to bring the carbon on the first day can do any of the makeup days the rest of the day of Yantif. And if he's not able, is not valid to bring the carbon Pesach on the first day, not the carbon Pesach, the Chagiga on the first day, so then he can't do the makeup date for the Yantif offering for the Chagiga on any of the other days. Amalur Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman, who heard this teaching from Ula that said, we'll just ask somebody in the that's tahor to leave Yerushalayim, said, go tell Zilu va'amru le'ula, go tell Ula, yeah, man sai is the akar sike, who's going to listen and remove the pegs from his tent, umashkene, and fold up his tent, v'rohit, and run out of Yerushalayim. Yeah, go find somebody that's going to offer to do that, to leave Yerushalayim in the middle of the in preparation of Yantif and pull his tent apart and go. In other words, that's not a practical thing to ask somebody to leave you to pick up and leave and go to a distance. You could ask somebody to become tamei, and then everybody can bring a carbon pesach and tamei and tuma, so he's not going to lose out in any way. But to leave Yerushalayim for that, nobody's going to pick up. Itma was said, "Are you Reuben, Zavin, and Miutan, tamei mason. So for a zav is not allowed to do the carbon pesach. It's a form of tumah. So if the majority were a zav and the minority were tamei mace, were in contact with had come in contact with someone deceased, and in this case they're not going to do the carbon pesach the first time because the majority are tumah of a zav, and also not the carbon the second pesach because they were majority of tumah, and so majority can't do the second pesach. So even the tamei mace people cannot do it in the first group, in the first pesach or the second pesach. Risha le'avdi, they can't do the first pesach. They have a miyuta because they're a minority. A miyuta le'avdi b'risha. They can't do the first pesach because they're a minority of tamei mace. B'sheni nami le'avdi kol hechad avdi tzibur b'risha avdi yachid b'sheni, because you need a community to have done, at least somebody has to have done the carbon pesach the first time round, and in order for people to have a makeup date the second time round in Iyar. But if the entire community did not do the carbon pesach the first time round because they were all tamei, the majority were tamei zav of let's call it gonorrhea, and the first and the minority were tamei mace, so you can't bring the carbon pesach in the first one. And so if there was nothing done in the first one, so an individual cannot do it in the second pesach either. Amar Shmuel. So Shmuel, when he heard this teaching in the name of Rav, sent a message to Rav. Zilu amru leila Abba. Go tell Abba. He called him Abba. Go tell Rav. The Torah says that Bnei Yisrael have to do the carbon pesach in its time. My obviously. What are you going to do with that verse where somebody's got to make the carbon pesach, and you're saying everybody's exempt the first or second pesach? Must be that they can do, since the majority of Yisrael are tamei, the tamei mace people at least can make the carbon pesach in the first time round. Amar luhu, so Rav responded, go tell Shmuel, well, what's he going to do in a case where everybody is tamei zav, where everybody has the tumah gonorrhea of zav? Or Zava, Zilu Amarle, Kikavakula Zava Mayavdasle. What are you going to do then? They don't bring the carbon pesach because they're tamei and there's no makeup date. Ela Kivan the Leafshar. Rather, what are you going to say? You can't bring the carbon pesach. You can't bring the carbon pesach. Haganami Leafshar. If you can't, you can't. Tomorrow we'll continue with this conversation of majority tamei mace, minority zav, etc.